Check. Check, check. Well, hello, everyone. Good to see you all. Thank you for being here. We are going to move into our forum conversation today. I've got a handout here that's less of a handout and more of I just wanted to grab some quotes, and it was in development, so this is the rough draft, and that would be fantastic. Thank you so much. So welcome, everyone, to the forum Liturgy 101. And I thought about it. I was like, I kept on trying to come up with like a catchy hook name, and I just could not do it. My brain was not functioning in that way. I should have just called it, Why Do We Do That? Because that's what we're talking about today, is what is going on behind the stuff that we do on a Sunday morning in gathered worship. And so the reason why this particular program is happening is because the questions have come up in conversation with deacons, with different committees, with different members of the congregation during coffee hour here and there of what do we do on a Sunday morning? What's behind that particular piece of our worship service? And for me, I'm obsessed with church history. And I'm obsessed with theology and, biblical studies and theological, all this stuff. This is what I like to talk about. And so if I have a chance to talk about it with people who are interested in asking these sorts of questions, I will take it. And so thank you for being here and being a part of this conversation. I'm going to keep it brief because I'm going to be honest, it's been a season, right? That we've had, a lot going on, and so this is going to be a briefer conversation than what I had originally planned. And my hope is that it might be a beginning of a longer conversation around not just why do we do what we do on a Sunday morning, what the history is and the meaning is behind this piece or that piece of our worship service, but also who are thinking through our heritage, our theological, our spiritual heritage that we kind of carry on and are passing on to the next generation of First Parish folks. And so the lineage of the Congregational Church and the lineage of the Unitarian Church and how those two traditions remain alive in us today and what they mean for us today. So that's kind of a down the line conversation. Today we're just talking about the actual pieces of our worship service, some questions that have come up in conversation with me, with the deacons, and I wanted to kind of give a space for us to hold that. And so as we open up the conversation, first I wanted to say, what do I mean by liturgy? What does that word mean? Let's start there, right? If you Google it, it literally means a public service or a public worship. It's basically the order of worship. It's the structure of the public gathering. It started out as not being particularly religious, but over time it became specific to a religious worship service, a public service. And it literally comes from the Greek, meaning the work of the people, from the Greek leto, public or people, and orgos, meaning work. It's the work of the people. It is what we do when we come together as the gathered people of faith, and we do this work together. It's what is coming out of our gathered relationship, our gathered community. Thinking of liturgy, or thinking of the order of service, like when you walk into the service on a Sunday morning and you get handed an order of worship, when you receive that, what perhaps might shift if you were to think of what you're looking at there as the work of the people? Is there what comes up for you when you make an association between that hard copy of the order of service and the phrase, the work of the people?
It's what's bringing us together. It's what we're going to do together.
Thank you.
I've also thought many times, wow, a lot of people must have put in a lot of work to get this thing coordinated.
Absolutely. There's a lot of different moving parts, and there's a lot of people that have to weigh in on what you actually receive when you walk into worship or you click download here, right, from your news brief. So anybody else, when you think of the work of the people, what comes up for you in association with the order of worship? Yeah. For me, I think something shifts. If, right now I'm one of the people that's like doing those moving pieces, trying to put the thing together. But for my whole life, I've been going to worship and thinking of what we do when we come into the space together as the work of the people rather than the work of that person. For me, is an important shift, that the order of worship isn't a script for somebody up there just to kind of blow through, but this is something that we're all participants in, that we're all doing this together, we're all engaged in some way, trying to make meaning in this particular moment, and we have these different pieces, these different components of the liturgy that we use as kind of vessels to try and hold all of that meaning, and sometimes we might look at one of those components and say, that doesn't really mean anything to me anymore. Maybe it meant something to somebody a long, long time ago, but it doesn't really, not really doing anything for me. But maybe for some of us, the fact that it's meant something for somebody for so long, in and of itself makes that particular component of the liturgy a vessel, something that you can kind of hold on to when you don't really know what else to say, right? When you don't really know what words to use in order to try and make meaning in this particular moment. So the liturgy is the order of service, but it's the work of the people. It's what we're doing together, and it's for many of us, it's something we've inherited, and yet it's something that we're constantly having to be in relationship with, to say, what does it mean today? One of the things we're thinking about today, and what my hope was with this conversation, was to think through where certain pieces came from, but also what does this mean for you and I and for First Parish in Lincoln today when we do this together? What are we saying when we do this together? And so before I launch into anything else, I wonder, what do you bring with you today when you think about the order of worship? What comes up for you as a moment where perhaps you have said, this is a really important moment in the service that I can't really put words around, but it's holy and sacred and special to me, or a moment that when we get there, something stops in your brain. You're like, I don't really know what to do here. I wonder, what do you love? What gives you life in the worship service? What questions and wonderings do you have about parts of the worship service? So either of those two questions, I open the floor up for that.
I don't think I'm going to answer either of them. I want to know what's coming because there's going to be music and prayers, and a lot of them are. So I sort of scan everything, and I like to know where the music came from, and how old the music is, and that all of that sets a tone with the prayers and the sermon. And so I'd like to see how it's organized, and I want those. I'm interested in those details. So that's where I am.
Anybody else? A part of the service?
I like the unspoken prayers. It gives me a time to stop and think about things.
That silence for us to hold that space together.
I like the prayers that, I guess it's called the pastoral prayer, either from a minister or from someone, a lay person, because it always brings sort of a fresh perspective. And it's good to hear from people in the congregation in that way, that they've taken the time to think about what they want to express. So.
I also really enjoy the pastoral prayers, and but I've never understood that term, pastoral prayer. Like, what exactly does? I understand pastoral and I understand prayer, but so is this somebody? Like, what's the significance of? Is it always a lay person? I don't think so. The reason I am here is because, for the life of me, I've never understood what is a doxology. Okay.
I second that.
Why do we do that? Yeah, that is the question that has come up several times recently to me that made me go, you know what, we should do a liturgy session. And so that's where we're going to land, actually, with this conversation. So what's the doxology? Yeah. But
One more question now. The first and second readings, I'm kind of curious how you think about those and what the order is.
that's great. Great questions. So fantastic. There's a lot that we do on a Sunday morning. And sometimes you might hear of certain congregations referred to as liturgical churches, which is a little bit of a kind of a misnomer because every church has a liturgy, even if it's not as embellished or detailed or intricate. The liturgy is just the things that you're doing together, as we discussed. But if you ever hear in conversation someone talking about a liturgical church, they're talking probably about churches that have a, quote, high liturgy or high church practice, which are typically Catholic, Episcopal churches, churches that have, perhaps Lutheran churches. They have many more parts, kind of back and forth, whereas some low church, and then it's kind of like a spectrum. You go down and you talk about low church. They tend to have less components, less moving parts, and it's less about perhaps. You can kind of feel it sometimes in the context of the architecture. That's one component of a liturgy. Liturgy is really determined and defined and limited and defined by the space in which you're gathering. What you can do together is really shaped by that. So that's a whole other forum that I'd want to talk about, architecture and liturgy, architecture and worship. So that's what we mean by liturgy. Those are the different parts that we're talking about. So I was going to do a whole history of Christian liturgy, which I'm not going to do. But I have a couple quotes here for you to take a look at and kind of think about the scope and the development of Christian liturgy. And I say Christian because First Parish in Lincoln, while being a large tent spiritual community and has people of all different spiritual identities and religious labels that they might resonate with, in its legacy, in its tradition, it's a descendant of the Christian tradition, and still shaped and influenced by it, even though it is not strictly solely a Christian faith community. So I want to name that. I'm talking about Christian tradition because that's what we're kind of formed and shaped by. It is not what we're limited to at all. So the Christian tradition, the Christian history, we talk about the roots of where our liturgy comes from. The earliest evidences we have of what the church did when they gathered together. You can find it in the New Testament. I have a quote here from Acts, that they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. So passing on the tradition of the teaching of the apostles, fellowship, connecting, community, right? Breaking of bread, which itself was communion. We could have a whole other side conversation about communion, what the theology of communion has been, how it has evolved over time. But in the time of the New Testament, it wasn't just like we get a little cracker and a little tiny cup of juice. It was a full meal, and that meal was the center of the worship service. So communion was integral to the early church, and particularly the New Testament church. So they dedicated themselves to the teaching, fellowship, community, breaking bread, and prayers. And what you might find is today there are some churches that are calling themselves dinner churches, and they're basing their liturgy off of that structure of people gathered around table together, praying together, fellowshipping together, sharing lessons and teachings one with another, but coming together around a meal. And so that's kind of like some of the roots of the liturgy. It eventually evolves. You can see Paul talking in 1 Corinthians 14. When you come together, each one has a hymn, a lesson, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Let all things be done for building up. So it's highly participatory. Everybody comes, and so kind of like every Sunday is a hymn sing. Every Sunday is people speaking out their prayers. Community prayers are kind of a descendant of this component of the liturgy, because everybody comes and has something that they bring to the service to lift up. He goes on with the structure of that, though. That could get a little chaotic, and so how do you keep it organized? And so Paul says, well, we want everyone to learn, everyone to be encouraged, but the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets, for God is a God not of disorder, but of peace. So it was like, okay, you had your word, you spoke your word of prophecy, time to pass the mic, right? So he was having a little bit of a pass the mic moment in the early church, which I think we can all say we're all familiar with. It is a lifelong journey to learn. The ancient church, the church met again in people's homes around table. Slowly but surely, there developed a script or a form of the liturgy. That form tended to be rooted around communion, so there developed prayers and lines that were said for communion, prayers and lines that were said for baptism. That's where the first structure started to come in. You can see that in one of these ancient writings called the Didache, which is like instructions for spiritual leaders in the ways that you should kind of order those different rituals. You can see here a long quote that I'm not going to read by Justin Martyr. He's writing to the Roman authorities. He's writing in 153 CE, and he's trying to say, so this is what we do at church. What do we do when we go to church? Because the Romans are saying, like, what's this new religion coming up, and what do they do together? And he kind of gives a summary of what it is that they do together. The memoirs of the apostles and the prophets are read, so we do those scripture readings, right? They're read for as long as time permits. They kept going, apparently. Then when the reader ceases, the president in a discourse admonishes and urges the imitation of all these good things. Then there's a sermon. Then we all rise together and send up prayers. We all pray together. When we cease from our prayer, bread is presented in wine and water, and the president in the same manner sends up prayers and thanksgiving according to his ability. I find that an interesting line. And people sing out their assent saying amen. Distribution, participation of the elements. Those who have means and are willing, each according to his own choice, gives what he will. So there's an offering. And then it is collected and deposited. And from that, he provides for the orphans and the widows, those who are in need. So the offering is dispersed for the nourishment of our community and for justice around the world, right? We make our assembly on Sunday, since it's the first day, and he says, that's when we're gathering. So you can kind of see that's one of the earliest examples we have of the church saying, this is what we do when we get together. We have prayer, we read scripture, we have a sermon, we have an offering that's used to support our community and to support the communities around us. we have fellowship, we have communion, right? So these elements that we do today, 2,000 years old, right? The medieval church, this is when the form of what happened in the gathered community became much more structured. Basically what happens is the church becomes, it goes from being a persecuted minority to being the religion of the empire. Now all of a sudden has all the pomp and circumstance of the empire imbued into it. Becomes highly embellished, very intricate, very detailed, and in many ways very beautiful. And it doesn't happen all at once. Basically, over the course of 500 years or so, and this is something that is interesting in church history that church historians have noted, is that around every 500 years or so, there's like a big shift in the church and the way the church functions and the way church works together. And just flagging, we're coming up on that 500-year mark, so there's a shift coming. But so about 500 years, once it becomes the official religion of the empire, now we can really spend time developing our liturgy. It goes from being something that ministers, pastors had more versatility in to now it's universalized, it's standardized. You walk into any church anywhere in the world, they're likely doing the same thing. And at that time, it was just one type of church, right? Where we eventually come in is in the wake of the Protestant Reformation, 1500, right? Another 500 years pass. And now all of a sudden, there is this movement toward, I can give you the whole spiel about where the Protestant Reformation comes from and why, but there were concerns about certain practices in the church, and in trying to reform from within, unfortunately, that was not successful, and that led then to a split and the development of different denominations. In the wake of those different denominations, basically the forms of worship multiplied from there. So we went from universalized, highly embellished, to diversified, and in that diversity, there were different approaches to how close we should remain to our former ways and how far we should go away from our former ways. So in the Protestant Reformation, you get some Protestant churches that still tried to really keep close to what they'd known. And then you'd get some that said, you know what? We need to strip away all that embellishment and get it as simple as possible. A big kind of universal shift that did take place during that time is the changing of the vernacular. So all of a sudden the liturgy went from Latin to, in the wake of the Protestant Reformation, Luther comes in and creates a new liturgy in German, in the common tongue. So the work of the people could be done by people speaking the language that they knew. Right? In England, it was the Book of Common Prayer. And this happened all over Europe. Now what happens is, like I said, you have some Protestants that say we don't want anything that feels like all of that embellishment that we were used to. And so that's where you kind of get the Puritans. During the Puritan control of England, they actually outlawed the Book of Common Prayer because they felt like it was too similar to what had been before. And so that's kind of our inheritance here in New England. There's a lot of that influence of how simple can we get in our liturgy? How straightforward, how simple can we get? Here's where First Parish in Lincoln comes in. So let's take a look at the original liturgy of the First Parish in Lincoln, founded in 1748. I got this liturgy from the Proceedings in Observance of the 150th Anniversary of the Organization of the First Church in Lincoln, Mass. So it gives a little chapter on what the gathered worship was like at First Parish, or First Church at this time in Lincoln, Mass. And here's that quote. I wonder if somebody else could read it as I've been talking for a bit. I'd like to read the order of service.
She says without her glasses. Okay. The order of service adopted by the church at its organization commenced with singing one of the Psalms of David, which was first read by the pastor. Then the tune was set by someone chosen for the purpose, after which one of the deacons, standing on the floor in front of the pulpit, proceeded to line off the psalm for the congregation to sing. The singing was followed by the long prayer of about a quarter of an hour, Ugh. And it was custom in those days for members of the congregation who were in trouble by reason of illness or special trial to ask the prayers of the church by bills or notes, and these were read by the pastor before the beginning the long prayer. Then came the sermon, whose length was determined by the hourglass placed on the pulpit before the eyes of both the minister and the congregation. And it is a well-attested fact that the ministers met the requirements of the occasion better than many in their congregations, who frequently needed the kindly efforts of the tithing man to remind them of the duty of the time and place. The sermon was followed by a shorter prayer, and the service was closed with a benediction.
Thank you. What do you notice in reading? Pretty simple, right? The only music is the a cappella singing of a responsive singing of a psalm, opening up the service. The minister would read the psalm, and then we would have a responsive singing of it. A long prayer, which opened up with community prayers, but people didn't pray them out loud. It was the prayer book, right? Or submitting a written prayer in advance that was given to the minister who would read out the prayers. And then 15 minutes of praying. It doesn't say who was doing that 15 minutes of praying. So the question around pastoral prayer, when did the tradition at First Parish start of a lay leader coming in and giving that longer prayer? And I don't know the answer to that question. I wonder if it came after the union of the two congregations, but it doesn't really say who was doing that prayer. My guess is it's the minister, right? After the prayer, sermon. I love that. Determined by an hourglass. We still have a little hourglass. It only is like a 2-minute hourglass, so it's not one we use for preaching. It was one that we were using for a while to time the 2 minutes or 3 minutes of silence, right? But that timing of the sermon, a short prayer and a benediction. What comes up for you in that? What do you feel like is sacred in that service? What do you feel like that says about that kind of community that the community was? It listened a lot. Yeah, it wasn't a very interactive sort of service, right? The text goes on to say, because this is a book that was written in 1898 for the 150th anniversary of the first church. And so they note, okay, so here are a couple ways that we have evolved in the 150 years since 1748. Well, we've added a responsive reading. That's good. So there's some sort of participation there. An invocation, a reading of the scriptures, right? So by sometime in the 150 years, the first unit of time of the church, the more readings were added. An anthem was added, and a hymn and a gloria, which is like a brief hymn of praise. Coming back to that in a minute. So a couple things that were added. I also wanted to note about music, right? Because you know that the earliest church didn't have music, and that really is coming out of that Reformation Puritan mindset. The simpler, the better. We want to get straight back to what they said was the biblical way to run things. This is how we should do things. Make it simple. Over time, as happened in the early church, happened in First Parish, the liturgy developed, became a little bit more detailed, a little bit more intricate. We added a couple more things. And one of the things that was added was music. And so a little bit of the history of the music at First Parish. The earliest hymns were metrical versions of the Psalms of David, like we said. That was in use until 1823 when Watts hymns were introduced. Isaac Watts, prolific hymn writer. The earliest singing was purely congregational, led by a deacon without instrument. Do we have any deacons in here? Right? Any deacons that would like to lead the a cappella singing, Paula? Eventually, a choir was formed between 1765 and 1770, and in 1788, professional choirsters, is what they were called, were hired to assist in leading the singing. And that launched, apparently, the First Parish in Lincoln became known locally as a place to go and listen to sacred music, as evidenced by a sermon by Dr. Stearns of Stearns Room fame, given in 1792, an exhibition of sacred music in Lincoln. And I wanted to read what he had to say because I think for many of us, the music is a really important part of why we gather today. I know that I'm not sure how much of that came up earlier, but I hear that often, that people come to First Parish and the singing and the music is really something that allows them to hold sacred space and deepen into their time in worship. So here's what Reverend Stearns said in his sermon about the music at First Parish. He says, "Brethren and sisters of the choir, with pleasure we have beheld your zeal and the animated diligence of your teacher. We have often had our ears refreshed by your agreeable performances, your attention by speaking your words plain and full to avoiding uncouth and vulgar pronunciation, to swelling or softening your strains according to the matter of the song, to express grief, joy, wonder, etc., by their natural tones, have given you this acceptance. Nature is the standard of taste, and what is truly natural will always please. We give you our thanks and wish you a blessing from the house of the Lord." So I think of that whenever I hear the anthem, right? And I get up to preach. For me, from my own experience as a worship leader, listening to that anthem is so important to me because it helps me in that transition between, oh, everything is going well, everything's going well. Oh, I'm so stressed about this thing and that thing. Oh, the service is, who did this, and kind of going all over the place. And it's hard to pause all of that and get up and say something meaningful for the edification and the good of all, right? After I've been ping-ponging around in my head, that moment of just pause and listen to the music right before I preach is for me, I feel ministered to as a minister in that moment, and it's a gift to me. And so I think of that quote whenever I am about to get up and preach, thank you, brethren and sisterin and siblings of the choir, right? Thank you for that gift. So you can kind of see First Parish liturgy has evolved over time. Looking at our liturgy today, we've already kind of pointed to some things that we want to talk about. One thing I wanted to highlight is the fact that of our covenant. We've had a lot of conversation in recent years, I think, about our covenant in, transition team and spiritual leanings, spiritual identities surveys and things like that. I wonder if anybody wants to say anything about what the covenant means or doesn't mean to you.
As a person who hasn't attended church much as a young person, I had never run across the idea of covenant or really knew anything about what it meant. So to come into a community where a covenant is spoken by oneself every single Sunday, and also the one at the end of the service, which everybody always forgets the name of, called a ministry, right. It was really very important and really changed sort of the way I looked at my life.
Well, I always wondered what that was too, and I somewhere in the recent past, was it a decade or so, I came across that it came from the Unitarians, and I said, wow, 1880. Because it just seemed like I don't remember it being a Congregationalist, so all right, you Unitarians can throw stuff in this. But I wish, I like the fact that it's date, and I kind of wish it would that date or say Unitarian so-and-so. And the other one, the call to ministry, I wish it would say First Parish and whatever date that was established. Because I know that because it happened before I came here, but people talked about how it was a real exercise of the congregation to come up, and I'm really impressed with it. So those are two things I would like you to add.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. I think it's really important for us. Yeah, it's a Unitarian. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes. You know, I think a lot of folks don't realize that our covenant doesn't originate at First Parish. It was a Unitarian covenant. It was written by a Unitarian minister, and people didn't know because you see the word Jesus in there, and people think that, oh, that must be part of the Christian heritage of our church, or maybe it was written by the folks that started after the union, right? But the covenant was not written by the members of the First Parish when that union took place. It was drawn from their Unitarian heritage by the Unitarian minister in the 1880s, and it became a covenant that was said at a lot of Unitarian churches. So if you go to a Unitarian church kind of across the country, usually there's some sort of covenant that is said. It is oftentimes this one. It's not always this one. There's another one that is a common covenant that you can also find in our hymnal if you look in the back of it. The gray one. Love is the law, or love is the spirit of this church, or something like that. And is how it starts. And so I really like it. And so, yes, go ahead.
So, I'd always heard that there was quite a big discussion of what the covenant and call to ministry would be when the church is formed. So where did the collaboration come in?
That collaboration came in with the call to ministry, and I don't know as much about the development of that one as I do about the covenant specifically. I will say that the covenant that we have is, there's one word that's tweaked from the original one. In the love of truth, I believe was originally in the freedom of truth. And so, yeah. But yes, and so it is something that is not unique to First Parish, and a lot of folks don't realize. I believe the call to ministry is unique to First Parish, or is a big piece of the collaboration. I think my understanding is in selecting that covenant as the covenant of the First Parish, there was probably a lot of work that went into accepting it, even though, because it's from a Unitarian minister, right? And so the Congregationalists are coming in and saying, if our covenant is going to be from the Unitarians, where does that leave me as a Congregationalist? And I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall on those conversations, right? Of like, what led to the Congregationalists saying, yes, this is a covenant for all of us, right? Not just one of our constituent groups. Yes, go ahead.
I was just going to say that when we first came here, it wasn't the service of all, it was the service of man. Of man, yeah. And the other thing I remember is we had a committee that created a call to ministry, and then I think another one to refine it. Is anybody on any of those committees that went on forever? Colin was on one of them.
If you take a look at our bylaws, it does say in the bylaws when the change happened from the service of man to the service of all. And I want to say it was like in the 60s. But yes, the original covenant did say the service of all, or service of man.
Yeah, and I would think with the Unitarian, in the spirit of Jesus, which I would think that would be like the congregational, thrown in, because Jesus, I was raised in the Catholic Church, so I'm all for Jesus. No, but there are, I guess if you were a strict Unitarian, that may not be. I don't know. But,
This is, the Unitarians came out of the congregational tradition, so I don't. When did they start? 1820s or 30s? So.
The Unitarians, it was like a slow evolution. Late 1700s. There's beginnings of these conversations, but 1800s is when it really happens. Yeah.
By the time they get to 1880, we can be a little more friendly to the Congregationalists. And also, I think for the our First Parish too, when they're doing a merger, you want to have something that they both sort of feel in common, and just say the spirit is really good.
Right, and I think it's important for us to remember, I mean, the Unitarian Universalist Association as it exists today is historically the union between the Unitarian Christians and the Universalist Christians, but they were both Christian denominations that combined in the early 60s, and since then have evolved to be more interfaith, and so they're not solely, there are Christian UUs, there's Buddhist UUs, there's humanist UUs, there's UUs of all different religions. It's a really interfaith sort of denomination at this point, but its roots are in two Christian denominations. And just because there weren't Trinitarian Christians, right, with the Unitarian Christians, that doesn't mean that they didn't like Jesus, right? They were still, Jesus is a teacher, he's human, they believed in the humanity of Jesus, and they emphasized that element of his nature. But they still referenced his teaching and held him as a prophet and someone that they should follow. And so to say in the spirit of Jesus would not have been difficult for a Unitarian minister in the 1800s at all. Now, when you bring it into UU congregations today, it's a little bit trickier, right? Because of the diversity that does exist at this point, a lot of UU churches have shied away and gone with the other covenant that we, find in our hymnal, because it doesn't explicitly name Jesus, but is a little bit more broad in its language. But the one that we chose is the one that names Jesus, and I think it probably had to do with because the fact that we're this union of Congregational and Unitarian, and my guess is it would have been a kind of an olive branch from the Unitarians to the Congregationalists saying, see, we can worship together, we like Jesus too, right? I want to move forward here, just to say, if you were to go into another sort of church, has anybody ever been to a church where a creed is said as part of the liturgy, right? Right. That's an important piece of a lot of highly liturgical churches. And it's a public gathering, a public profession of belief. I believe in God the Father, Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, The Unitarian Universalist and the United Church of Christ are not creedal traditions, they are covenantal traditions. And so if you go into a UCC church, you might hear a creed, but more than likely you'll hear a covenant. And if you go into a UU church, you'll hear not a creed, or you won't say a creed, I believe, you'll say a covenant of this is how we will be together. And so that's an important element of our liturgy at First Parish because of the fact that we are not a church that when we gather together are coming together around a particular belief system. We're coming together around our commitment to be in community with one another, and build a better world together and journey together. So with that said, let's talk doxology. Yeah. What is a doxology? It comes from the Greek doxa and logos, doxa meaning glory, logos meaning word, a word or a statement of glory. It basically, in the context of a worship service, means a brief song of praise, usually 2-3 lines. You'll see doxologies in the Bible, verses that are kind of like set off in a sort of hymn sort of way, and they are expressions of praise. The one that probably a lot of people are familiar with, that's kind of, if you are ever talking to someone that is a Christian of a different tradition, you say the doxology. Anybody know which one they're probably thinking of? Yeah, that first one. Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Right. So that doxology, that brief hymn of praise, was written by Thomas Ken. He was an Anglican priest in 1674, and it just took off, right? So a lot of churches incorporated that brief doxology, that brief hymn of praise, at some point in the worship service. It became very, very prominent in the Episcopal Church, so if you're familiar, if you attended an Episcopal church, you probably sang that one at some point in time in the service every week, right? Lutheran churches, Methodist churches, UCC churches, just basically a wide range of churches would use that doxology. Now, First Parish in Lincoln does not use the doxology, the one that is commonly used, likely because of the fact that we are not all Trinitarians, and in fact, very, very few, I would venture to say, Trinitarians in our midst. I'm a stealthy one, but don't tell anybody. So the one that we ended up going with is this one by Isaac Watts, and I found it interesting in my research about the history of First Parish liturgy is when the very first hymns that First Parish ever sang were by Isaac Watts. He was the hymn writer that we went to when we started to move away from just Psalms of David to now we want to do hymns. Isaac Watts was our guy. Well, this one is his doxology, set to the same tune that we sing every week, From All That Dwell Below the Skies. Right? Let the Creator's praise arise, let the Redeemer's name be sung through every land by every tongue. What do you notice about this Isaac Watts version in thinking about the one that we sing every week?
Okay. We have redeemers as plural.
We have redeemers as plural, and what else is plural? Names, right? Yes. So we have redeemers, as in more than one redeemer. We put that apostrophe after the S, as if to say there is more than one redeemer. And we have an S next to names. Well, who did that? I would love to know. Any thoughts? I don't know who did that. It's not a typo. The original is singular, redeemer, singular, as in Jesus, singular name. Some point, they made that plural. And I wonder what we all think of that.
I think it was recent. I mean, in the last 30 years. I think it's in the last 30 years, or if not. Yeah, I mean, since I've been coming to the church, it's definitely was a change.
I remember this originally, when we first started coming, it was
Janet's, yeah. Yeah. For the folks online, the conversation is we're trying to figure out when this occurred, right? Sometime in the last 30 years. We don't know when did the change happen. You know, it's funny. I've been in deacons meetings where people have said, because when I did the first edits of the order of worship, I think last year, I had put the apostrophe in the wrong place. And I got a note saying, we need to remember that apostrophe needs to be after the S and not before, because here at First Parish, we are inclusive. We're not saying that there's just one Redeemer. There's many Redeemers. I just wonder what you think of that. Oh, I know who wrote the note. That's not the point. But maybe they might have a better memory. No, and they're someone who knows the history of First Parish, and so I would start there too. Yeah, they would probably know. Yeah, and this is not an anti-sending me a note. It's good for me to know that I should have put that apostrophe where it needed to be. But it's just, I'm curious, what do you think of making Redeemer plural? Makes the church more inclusive. I love it. Yay. Okay. Does Buddhism have a redeemer? Does Buddhism have a redeemer? Does atheism have a redeemer? Does Judaism have a redeemer? Yes, yeah. So we can say maybe Judaism, Christianity. Does Islam have a redeemer? Muhammad is not a redeemer in their theology. There is no theology of redemption in Buddhism. There is no theology of redemption. So folks have said, go ahead.
Sorry. I mean, but in Buddhism or in others or even in atheism, isn't it the self? I mean, yourself can be your own redeemer. I mean, redeem yourself.
The self can be a redeemer, perhaps in a humanist thought process. I raise this because this is another thing. I get notes, right? And I've gotten notes from people saying, I'm really uncomfortable with the language of redeemer. I know you're trying to be inclusive, but actually I don't believe in a redemption. I don't need to be redeemed. I'm not a sinner. And the idea that a redeemer's name is going to be sung through every land by every tongue really sounds like colonization to me. Colonization, like you need to go and tell, because that's what historically evangelism of the church was. go and make every land and every tongue sing the name of this Redeemer, because they over there need to be saved, right? And so, because that's kind of embedded in that Isaac Watts version, and the intention to be more inclusive with Redeemer, I think a good move. But I also think, just to note that that's not going to be everybody's take when they hear that. And it often does come from a position of someone who is historically, traditionally Christian, making a move toward inclusivity, which is wonderful, but perhaps still being rooted in the perspective of Christianity without realizing it.
I'm wondering if you could sort of unpack redemption a little bit, because, I think we all need to be redeemed sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. For me personally, problem with the language of redemption. I root my understanding of redemption in the Exodus story, where God presents God's self as the one who's going to come and free the people from their oppression, free the Israelites from their bondage and slavery. And so that is the way that God is depicted, is as a redeemer, as a savior, someone who sets free. Right? That's the language how I understand it and how I interpret it in my mind. Let the one who frees the oppressed, let liberation's name be sung through every land by every tongue, right? That's how I edit that in my brain. However, historically, redemption in the Christian tradition has meant that every person is born dead in sin and needs to be saved from their sins by Jesus' death on the cross, and that Jesus' death is a payment in the same way that God set the Israelites free from slavery. God sets all of us free from sin through the payment of Jesus' death on the cross. That's what the baggage that language has for a lot of people. And while I can interpret it differently in my head, some people can't. And that's not to say we should get rid of our doxology. And that's not what I'm saying. It's just, where does our doxology come from? These are conversations that have come up when people ask me, why do we do that? Why do we sing that? And so I bring it to you as folks that were interested in having that conversation. I also want to name that there's another version of that Isaac Watts, right? Isaac Watts' doxology was adapted by the UUs, like they do. And it is found in the Gray Hymnal, and it says, "From all that dwell below the skies, let songs of hope and faith arise. Let peace, goodwill on earth be sung through every land by every tongue." So that is the UU version that is found in the Gray Hymnal, just naming that. And in worship planning meetings, we've had this conversation a couple times of, what if we were to swap out the doxology and make it a rotating one, to where it's not the same doxology every single week. Maybe we'll have this one time. Maybe we'll have another one time. Is there room for expanding our language of that brief song of praise? Why do we do it then? At that moment, right? The reason why we typically do that after the offering is because embedded in both of those, just so you know, the doxology, if you were to go to different churches, sometimes it's at the end of the service, sometimes it's the beginning of the service, so it does tend to move around. A lot of congregations do it in response to the offering, and it's because it's a moment to give thanks for what we've been given. It's a response of gratitude. So, praise God from whom all blessings flow, right? And identifying the fact that I have been given much. I am expressing my thanks and praise for what I've been given, both through word and through giving back, right? And so it's the same sort of thing in "From all that dwell below the skies, let the Creator's praise arise." It is intended to be an annual or a weekly expression of gratitude, right? Another piece that I wanted to talk about with what's happening in that moment in the space, right? We all have just passed the plate. We've given of what we have been given, we give in return, in response. And then that whatever music is playing stops, we transition into the doxology, and what happens? We stand up, and what else happens? What do the ushers do? The ushers bring the offering forward. And so this is rooted in an ancient practice. Once upon a time, we did not pass plates in churches, that the offering was given by procession. So everyone in the room would stand up and one by one process up to the front with their gift, their offering. Throughout early church and ancient period, that's what was done through the medieval period. Eventually, what happens is we evolve, plates are passed, and the ushers now, today, if you go to a lot of different churches, traditions, not just First Parish, the ushers, after taking the offering, will walk forward with the plates. They are doing that in place of, in representation of the entire congregation. And so that's where that bit of pageantry comes from. It's because on behalf of the entire church, we have gathered together our gifts, and we come and we present that gift to God, right? That's the reason for bringing it forward. Now we might have, again, different language, different understandings today, but that's where that tradition comes from. It's a collective, right? We are all together in this, and they are representing you when they go forward with your gift. Much more to be said. We are 12:30, and I don't want to keep taking your time. I wanted to also have a longer conversation about sharing of the peace. It's a really, I think, important element of the liturgy to me, and it's not something we do every single week, but I'd like to have a conversation about it with folks that have questions around why we've done it maybe once a month or so over the last year. Yeah. Any questions, comments, things if we were to continue this conversation? Again, I'm very interested in having another conversation around theology, particularly Unitarian and congregational theology, and thinking about how that still lives on here at First Parish. But I'm wondering what this brought up for you that you'd like for me to think about as we keep talking about this.
Well, the doxology, the first one has a sense of maleness to it, where the second and third don't. And so if you could alternate between those, put in the dates of when Watts did it, that might, but the first one is like sort of old. But all the other stuff, you can do anything, and I'll be here.
Thank you. Any other thoughts, doxology questions or comments, or liturgy in general?
Why that particular tune?
Oh, that's such a good question. It was written, It is clunk. That's an interesting question. I would need to loop Miranda into that part. I believe the tune was pre what's his name? Thomas Kent. Ken. So it was like 1600s, and it still has that element to it, right? So very stark. And so he wrote his words to that tune. It's called the Old 100th. It is the tune that a lot of psalms were sung to. The thing to remember is back in the day, not everybody was literate. They didn't have music in front of them, paper in front of them. And so the music needed to be easily remembered. And so they had tunes that were the set tunes that everything else would be written to, right? And so it was just one of the main ones that's been kind of passed down. It absolutely could get a shift. That could get a shift too, yes. The tune to the doxology. Where did that come from? Clunky, yes. Can be jarring, yeah. So what do you think? Do you think if one week we said, hey, we're doing a different doxology that flows better with whatever the offertory was, people, if we did a different tune and a different doxology? Uh-huh.
From this kind of flag thing, all of a sudden the volume goes up, and it's like, whoa, everybody stand up.
A jarring shift in tone, yes.
The second version,
Our third version, I guess. Yeah.
The adapted doxology. Yeah, it's a good one. It's a good one. All right, well, again, thank you all for being here, and I hope we'll continue having theology and church history conversations. I'm a bit of a nerd, so anytime. Thank you. Thank you.